Racial tensions came to a head in the 1960s in a massive popular uprising. The presidents at the time, Kennedy and Johnson, had a huge impact on the course of the civil rights movement. In this documentary, we will tell what the people and what they did in this movement. While many people think that fighting the Civil War gave African Americans the rights they deserve, in many instances, this simply wasn't true. Over time, the tensions rose until they overflowed, and many people demanded change.
Civil rights are your individual rights that you were basically born with here in the United States. I think of civil rights, I think back to Thomas Jefferson. It was life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Those things that I do and that aren't going to infringe on anybody else and cannot be taken away from me by the government or anybody else, I think.
Civil rights for me was the fighting of minorities to gain the rights that are afforded to us in the Constitution. When we look at American history, all men were created equal. Originally, that was white landowning men. And so as we move on, do those words really mean, what the founders wanted them to mean as we move forward in history? And so when we get to the post-World War II era, you have African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and others wanting the same rights that white Americans had.
So the civil rights movement, we have to understand, wasn't really a top-down thing. It was kind of happened with the people. The people wanting to change things. Obvious people that we know, like Martin Luther King. Kennedy was aware of it. He was very cautious at first. His party was the party that was into it, and I think if it would have been interesting to see if he had lived, what would have happened, because a lot of the civil rights movement came after his death, actually. We were definitely moving that way as a country. He was slowly moving that way as a president. To understand, Kennedy was not super progressive in that fact, but he was aware, and most of it actually came after him, I believe. One thing about Johnson, he was a senator, a very powerful senator before he became vice president. So he knew how to get laws and bills through Congress. He was often referred to as the master of the Senate because he was such an expert at that. He was also an opportunist. The death of Kennedy united the country, and he knew that he had a small window of time to get those things through. So knowing how the bureaucracy and all the things work in Washington, he pushed those things through with the spirit of kind of, let's do this for President Kennedy. This is what he had wanted, but he definitely, the opportunity and the expertise was definitely helped him push things through.
To a large degree, Kennedy was more of a cold warrior, and I think while he did help in a lot of ways, was more concerned about the Cold War and the Soviets. With Johnson, he wanted to have the Great Society, his war on poverty, and to improve civil rights. But at the end of the day, he's going to get bogged down with Vietnam. And so it's going to ultimately, he's going to get some things passed. But as a whole, a lot of what he wanted isn't going to come to fruition. It just doesn't work out because of all the money that we're spending in Vietnam.
It was kind of a spark, I would say, that these things were obviously going to happen. It was that spark that produced that fire that got these things passed sooner than they would have without it.
Well, I think it actually helped at the end of the day, and I know that seems kind of harsh that his death helped, but it does, because I think a lot of people after Kennedy is assassinated are willing to say, here are some of Kennedy's dreams. He couldn't realize them, but we can. And so I think Johnson is able to use people's, maybe not guilt, but sadness over JFK's death to say, you know what, this is something that we can push forward, because a lot of Americans, they loved Kennedy and they want to help some of his goals come to fruition.
Then the Democratic Party wasn't as liberal or progressive as it is then. It's all kind of reversed. Like there in the South was very Democratic then. Johnson famously said as he passed those bills that he was going to give the South to the Republicans for a generation, which he has even more so. So in some ways it kind of backfired on them, and he knew it. But I personally think Johnson is probably the most interesting political figure of the last 100 years, because he knew these things that he was going to pass was going to hurt his party in the short term, but it was going to make a big progress in the United States and the civil rights for forever.
I think at the end of the day, there are still a lot of Southern Democrats who were racist, who didn't really want to help African Americans, but after the death of Kennedy, there is some guilt there to where they can say, even to their constituents, I may not agree with this 100%, but it's what John F. Kennedy wanted, and so I'm willing to vote for it. And so this ultra-conservative element in the Southern Democratic Party maybe won't give them a pass, but is willing to at least understand why they're voting the way they do. I think for some Southern Democrats, it actually will help them, for lack of a better term, come out of the closet and wanting to be more liberal or more progressive. And so they can vote for it and use that as an excuse and not be punished for it in their next election.
That we still have work to do. We've come a long ways. It's hard for me to think that, in my grandparents' life that was going on, and now that, we still have a long ways to go, I think.
I think it's like a big change, but still there's still needs to be.
It was a big change, yes, obviously, but there's still work to be done.
Well, I'd like to say that, there is no more racism and everybody has the same rights, but that's just not true. I do believe we took many important steps, such as the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights bills that got passed to give more rights to disenfranchised groups. And I think, again, we see that today with a lot of people wanting to have more rights for those, not necessarily because of race, but more dealing with economics. Today it's more of the have and the have-nots, in conflict with each other than it is black and white or whites, Hispanics, and so on and so forth. I believe we will see this next round of, if you're talking about civil rights, be more about economics.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe we're still in the civil rights movement?
I hesitate to call it a civil rights movement because, again, I think we talk about predominantly the 50s and 60s with African American rights when we truly mean civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. I would say that we are in a movement now to have more equality. Unfortunately, part of the problem is we have Republicans and Democrats who definitely can't get along. I feel like we need more statesmen, as we had in the past. People like Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York and the former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. These men, while they disagreed with their opponents, still respected them, still could come together and talk to them. And today, it's really an us versus them mentality, and I don't see a lot of compromise on either side, and that really concerns me moving forward.